The television studio lights blazed hot as the red camera light flicked on, signaling live broadcast to millions of viewers nationwide. Host Sarah Mitchell leaned forward with that predatory smile her audience had learned to recognize, ready to spring her carefully planned trap on tonight's guest. Across from her sat Jonathan Roumie, the beloved actor who had touched hearts worldwide portraying Jesus in The Chosen. But Sarah had done her research, or so she thought, digging up what she believed were controversial historical debates that would catch Jonathan completely off guard and create the viral television moment her producers desperately craved. The conversation started pleasantly enough, with standard questions about the show's success and impact. Jonathan spoke graciously about the responsibility of portraying Jesus and the profound letters from viewers whose lives had been changed. But Sarah was just setting the stage, building false comfort before delivering what she believed would be her knockout punch. Her questions grew sharper, more loaded with assumptions about mythology surrounding biblical figures and problematic portrayals of women in religious texts. Then came the moment that changed everything. Sarah's voice took on that cutting edge her producers had trained her to use when going for the kill. "Jonathan, let's talk about Mary Magdalene. Now, we all know the real story there, don't we? Let's be honest about what she actually was, a woman of questionable reputation who somehow got elevated to sainthood by a church that needed to sanitize an embarrassing association with Jesus. Isn't it time we stopped pretending these biblical figures were anything more than products of their time?" The studio fell silent. Jonathan's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, his eyes focusing with laser-like intensity. What Sarah had just done wasn't simply ask a controversial question. She had attacked one of Christianity's most important figures based on centuries-old misinterpretations that serious biblical scholars had long since debunked. She had challenged not just a television character, but a woman whose story of devotion and courage had inspired millions throughout history. Jonathan looked directly into Sarah's eyes, his voice carrying quiet authority that transformed the studio's atmosphere. "Sarah, I think we need to have a conversation about who Mary Magdalene really was, because what you've just described bears absolutely no resemblance to the historical figure that serious biblical scholarship has revealed." But what Jonathan revealed next about the real Mary Magdalene would not only shock Sarah and the viewing audience, it would expose centuries of deliberate misrepresentation and reveal truths that would leave Sarah questioning everything she thought she knew about history's most misunderstood woman. The Truth Talk studio represented everything that modern television had become, a carefully orchestrated theater where controversy was manufactured and reputations were built or destroyed in 30-minute segments. Sarah Mitchell had climbed to the top of daytime television through a simple but effective formula: find the pressure points of her guests and press them until something dramatic happened. At 42, she commanded one of the highest-rated talk shows on cable news, her sharp wit and fearless questioning style earning her both devoted fans and powerful enemies. Tonight's booking had been months in the making, landing Jonathan Roumie during the peak of The Chosen's global success. But Sarah's research team had uncovered what they believed was the perfect angle of attack. They had spent weeks diving into historical debates about Mary Magdalene, cherry-picking controversial theories and outdated scholarship that painted the biblical figure in the most scandalous light possible. Their strategy was simple: force the gentle actor who portrayed Jesus into an impossible position where he would either have to defend the indefensible or admit that his faith was built on fabrications. They had no idea they were about to face someone whose knowledge of biblical history and ancient languages ran deeper than most seminary professors. Jonathan Roumie sat across from Sarah with a calm presence that had made him beloved by millions of viewers worldwide. At 49, his journey to The Chosen had been anything but conventional: years of struggling actor work, deep spiritual searching, and intensive study of both his craft and his faith. What most people didn't know about Jonathan was that his portrayal of Jesus wasn't just acting, it was the culmination of decades spent studying not just the Gospels, but the historical context, archaeological evidence, and scholarly debates surrounding every aspect of first-century Christianity. He had learned Hebrew and Aramaic, spent time with biblical historians, and developed relationships with archaeologists working in the Holy Land. The stakes tonight were higher than either participant initially realized. For Sarah, this interview represented a chance to cement her reputation as television's most fearless interviewer, someone willing to challenge even the most beloved figures in entertainment. Her producers had promised her that creating controversy around The Chosen would generate weeks of social media buzz, debates across religious communities, and the kind of viral moments that translated into ratings gold. But she had made a critical miscalculation, assuming that an actor, no matter how dedicated, would crumble when faced with what she believed were irrefutable historical contradictions. For Jonathan, this moment represented something far more significant than career advancement or publicity for his show. Every question about biblical figures, every challenge to the historical accuracy of the Gospels, was a direct attack on the foundation of faith that had transformed his own life and the lives of millions of viewers who had found hope and meaning through The Chosen. He understood that his response tonight would echo far beyond the studio, influencing how people viewed not just Mary Magdalene, but the entire question of whether biblical figures deserved respect or dismissal in modern discourse. The television audience watching at home had no idea they were about to witness a collision between two completely different approaches to truth. Sarah represented the modern media's tendency to reduce complex historical figures to sensational soundbites, while Jonathan embodied a deeper tradition of scholarly inquiry combined with genuine reverence for the people whose stories had shaped human civilization. The trap had been set with precision, but the prey was far more dangerous than the predator had anticipated. As the commercial break ended and cameras rolled again, both Sarah and Jonathan were unaware that their confrontation would become a defining moment not just in their careers, but in the ongoing cultural debate about how ancient wisdom should be treated in contemporary society. The battle lines had been drawn, but only one of them truly understood the battlefield they were about to enter. What Sarah didn't realize was that Jonathan had been preparing for this exact moment his entire life, and her carefully planned ambush was about to become his greatest opportunity to defend not just a misunderstood historical figure, but the very integrity of biblical scholarship itself. Behind the scenes, Sarah's production team had spent the commercial break making final adjustments to their attack strategy. Her executive producer whispered last-minute talking points into her earpiece, reminding her of the specific historical claims they wanted her to make about Mary Magdalene. They had compiled what they believed was an arsenal of controversial theories from fringe scholars and sensationalist historians, carefully selecting the most provocative interpretations that would force Jonathan into an impossible corner. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: present these theories as established historical fact, challenge Jonathan to defend what they assumed he couldn't possibly defend, and watch him either crumble or reveal himself as someone willing to ignore historical evidence for the sake of religious fantasy. Sarah felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with moments like this, the electric anticipation of landing a career-defining interview that would dominate headlines and social media for weeks. Her researchers had assured her that no actor, regardless of how deeply he had studied his role, would be prepared for the level of historical complexity they were about to unleash. They had found obscure academic papers, controversial documentaries, and fringe theories that painted Mary Magdalene in the most scandalous light possible, confident that Jonathan would be caught completely off guard by their depth of preparation. What none of them realized was that Jonathan had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of encounter. During the commercial break, he sat quietly in his chair, not reviewing notes or consulting with handlers, but simply centering himself in the way that had become second nature during his years of intensive spiritual and academic preparation. His approach to playing Jesus had never been superficial or purely artistic. From the moment he was cast in The Chosen, he had embarked on what amounted to a doctoral-level study of first-century Palestine, early Christian history, and the complex web of historical evidence surrounding every figure mentioned in the Gospels. The cameras rolled again, and Sarah launched into what she believed would be her systematic dismantling of Christian historical claims. She began with seemingly innocent questions about the research process behind The Chosen, allowing Jonathan to speak comfortably about the show's commitment to historical accuracy and biblical authenticity. But even these early questions carried subtle implications, gentle probes designed to test his knowledge and identify potential weaknesses she could exploit later. Sarah was building her case methodically, like a prosecutor preparing to present evidence that would destroy the defendant's credibility. "It's fascinating how much work goes into making these biblical stories feel authentic," Sarah said, her tone carrying just a hint of skepticism that regular viewers would recognize as her signature approach. "But of course, we have to acknowledge that many of these figures exist more in the realm of faith than in documented history, don't we?" The question was designed to sound reasonable while actually containing a loaded assumption that biblical figures lacked historical verification, a claim that serious historians had long since abandoned but that still circulated in popular media. Jonathan responded with characteristic grace, explaining the extensive archaeological and historical evidence that supported the existence and activities of the people portrayed in The Chosen. But Sarah wasn't really listening to his answers. She was waiting for her moment, watching for the opening that would allow her to spring the trap she had so carefully constructed. Her questions grew more pointed, touching on the creative liberties that she implied were necessary when dealing with figures who were more legendary than historical. The studio atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Camera operators adjusted their positions, sensing that the interview was building towards something significant. Sarah's production team monitored social media feeds, watching for early reactions from viewers who could sense the tension building between host and guest. Everything was proceeding exactly according to their plan, with Sarah methodically undermining the historical foundation of Christian belief while Jonathan maintained his composure and dignity. But what Sarah didn't realize was that her carefully planned approach was actually giving Jonathan everything he needed to prepare his defense. Every loaded question, every subtle implication, every attempt to frame biblical figures as mythological rather than historical was revealing the depth of her misunderstanding and the superficial nature of her research. She thought she was setting a trap, but she was actually walking into one herself. As the interview progressed toward the moment when Sarah would launch her direct attack on Mary Magdalene, neither she nor her production team had any idea that they were about to face someone whose knowledge of the historical evidence was deeper and more comprehensive than anyone they had ever encountered on television. The ambush they had planned was about to become their own education in biblical scholarship, delivered by someone who combined genuine expertise with unshakable moral conviction. The stage was perfectly set for a confrontation that would expose not just Sarah's ignorance, but the broader media tendency to reduce complex historical figures to sensational caricatures without bothering to examine the actual evidence. The moment Sarah had been building toward finally arrived as the interview entered its third segment. She leaned forward with that predatory confidence that had made her famous, her voice taking on the sharp edge that viewers recognized as the signal that someone was about to be challenged in the most uncomfortable way possible. The studio lights seemed to intensify as she prepared to deliver what she believed would be the knockout blow that would expose Jonathan as either ignorant of historical facts or willing to defend the indefensible for the sake of his religious beliefs. "Jonathan, let's get real for a moment," Sarah began, her tone shifting from professional courtesy to prosecutorial intensity. "We've been dancing around this, but I think it's time to address some hard truths about the figures your show portrays as virtuous saints. Take Mary Magdalene, for example. Now, serious historians have made it very clear what she actually was in first-century Palestine." She paused for dramatic effect, allowing the tension to build as cameras captured Jonathan's measured expression. "We're talking about a woman who was essentially a prostitute, someone whose relationship with Jesus was likely far more complicated and scandalous than your show would ever dare to portray." The studio fell into an uncomfortable silence as Sarah's words hung in the air like an accusation. Her production team had crafted this moment carefully, choosing language that would sound authoritative while actually repeating centuries-old misinterpretations that had been thoroughly debunked by legitimate biblical scholarship. But Sarah wasn't interested in legitimate scholarship. She was interested in creating a viral moment that would generate controversy and drive ratings, regardless of its accuracy. Jonathan's expression remained calm, but those who knew him well could see the subtle shift in his posture, the way his eyes focused with laser-like intensity on Sarah's face. She had just attacked not only a character from his show, but a real historical figure whose reputation had been systematically destroyed by centuries of deliberate misrepresentation. More than that, she had done so with the casual confidence of someone who clearly had never bothered to examine the actual historical evidence. "But it gets worse," Sarah continued, emboldened by what she interpreted as Jonathan's silence being evidence of his inability to respond. The early church had a real problem on their hands, didn't they? Here they were, trying to build a religion around a man who apparently had some very questionable associations. So they had to sanitize the story, turn a prostitute into a saint, create this fictional narrative of redemption that would make their founder look more respectable to potential converts. Each word was calculated to inflict maximum damage, designed to force Jonathan into a position where he would either have to admit that the foundations of Christian belief were built on deliberate deceptions, or attempt to defend positions that Sarah believed were historically indefensible. Her research team had assured her that this approach was foolproof, that no actor, regardless of his preparation, could possibly counter the weight of what they presented as established historical consensus. The camera operators instinctively adjusted their focus, sensing that they were capturing something significant. Social media monitors in the control room reported that engagement was spiking as viewers began to sense the confrontation building. Sarah's executive producer smiled behind the cameras, believing they had successfully cornered one of television's most beloved figures and forced him into an impossible situation. I mean, let's be honest about this, Jonathan. Sarah pressed forward, her voice gaining confidence as she prepared to deliver what she believed would be the final blow. Your entire show is built on presenting these sanitized, romanticized versions of people who were actually quite different from how you portray them. Mary Magdalene wasn't some devoted follower seeking spiritual truth. She was a woman of questionable morals who somehow managed to attach herself to Jesus's movement, and the church spent centuries trying to clean up that embarrassing association. Jonathan sat quietly through this barrage of accusations, his hands folded calmly in his lap, his expression revealing nothing of the thoughts racing through his mind. What Sarah didn't realize was that every word she spoke was revealing the depth of her ignorance and the complete superficiality of her research. She thought she was presenting established historical fact, but she was actually repeating discredited theories that serious biblical scholars had abandoned decades ago. The studio audience could feel the tension building to a breaking point. Sarah had thrown down a gauntlet that challenged not just Jonathan's professional work, but the historical integrity of one of Christianity's most important figures. The attack had been delivered with surgical precision, designed to humiliate and destroy credibility. But as the silence stretched and cameras captured Jonathan's measured response, everyone in the studio was about to discover that Sarah had made the most catastrophic miscalculation of her career. What she had just unleashed wasn't simply a controversial statement designed to generate debate, but a direct challenge to someone whose knowledge of Mary Magdalene's actual historical significance was deeper and more comprehensive than anything she could have possibly imagined, and whose response would not only defend a misunderstood woman, but expose the dangerous ignorance that passed for journalism in modern media. Jonathan looked at Sarah with quiet authority that immediately transformed the studio atmosphere. Sarah, I appreciate your passion for historical accuracy, but you've been given thoroughly discredited information. The idea that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute isn't supported by any biblical text or historical evidence. That's a myth created centuries later. Sarah's confident smile faltered. Jonathan, multiple historical sources suggest. Which sources? Jonathan interrupted gently but firmly. Pope Gregory the Great sermon from 591 AD? That was a deliberate conflation of three different women, done for political reasons. The Catholic Church itself officially corrected this error in 1969, acknowledging that Mary Magdalene was never described as a prostitute in any authentic historical document. The studio fell silent as Jonathan's words demolished Sarah's research. Her team had never encountered this level of historical precision. Let me tell you who Mary Magdalene actually was, Jonathan continued, his voice gaining passion. She was a woman of significant means from prosperous Magdala, who used her own resources to support Jesus's ministry. The Gospels specifically mention she and other women provided financial backing. She wasn't some dependent follower, she was a benefactor, a leader, a woman of substance. Sarah attempted to regain control. You're cherry-picking evidence to support religious beliefs. Am I? Jonathan raised his eyebrows. Luke explicitly states she was, from whom 7 demons had gone out. which in first-century context meant serious illness, not moral failing. She was healed and became one of his most devoted supporters. And here's what makes her truly extraordinary: she was the first person to witness the resurrection. In a culture where women's testimony wasn't legally valid, Jesus chose a woman to be the first messenger of Christianity's most important event. Sarah realized her ambush had backfired spectacularly. "You're trying to rewrite history." Jonathan smiled like a teacher whose student finally asked the right question. "I'm simply telling you what the historical evidence actually says, rather than repeating myths created to diminish one of Christianity's most important women." But what Jonathan revealed next about the deliberate campaign to destroy Mary Magdalene's reputation would shock Sarah so completely that she would question everything she thought she knew about historical research and journalism itself. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the weight of someone about to reveal a truth that had been hidden for centuries. "Sarah, what I'm about to tell you might be the most important thing you hear in this entire interview. The systematic destruction of Mary Magdalene's reputation wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate campaign orchestrated by early church leaders who felt threatened by her influence and authority." The studio atmosphere shifted dramatically as everyone realized they were about to witness something unprecedented. Sarah's face showed visible confusion and growing alarm as she began to understand that her carefully planned attack had not only failed, but had opened the door to revelations that would completely transform the conversation. Jonathan's final revelation came with the quiet intensity of someone who had witnessed too many historical injustices remain buried. "Sarah, the most tragic part of this entire story is how this deliberate character assassination affected generations of women. When you turn the first witness of the resurrection into a symbol of female shame, you send a message that echoes through centuries. You tell women that their highest aspiration should be seeking male forgiveness rather than claiming their own spiritual authority." The studio was completely silent now, every person present understanding they had witnessed something far more significant than a typical television interview. Sarah sat motionless, her face reflecting the dawning realization that she had not only been wrong about Mary Magdalene, but had participated in perpetuating one of history's most damaging lies about women's role in religious leadership. "The real Mary Magdalene," Jonathan continued, his voice filled with both sadness and hope, "represents everything that threatens systems built on limiting women's influence. She was wealthy, independent, spiritually gifted, and trusted by Jesus above his male disciples. That's why her story had to be destroyed. That's why she had to be transformed from a leader into a cautionary tale." Sarah finally found her voice, but it came out shaken and uncertain. "Jonathan, if what you're saying is true, then centuries of teaching, of artwork, of literature about Mary Magdalene has been based on a lie." Her words hung in the air like a confession, an admission that she was beginning to understand the magnitude of what had been revealed. "Not a lie, Sarah. A deliberate distortion designed to serve political purposes," Jonathan corrected gently. "But here's the beautiful thing about truth. It has a way of surviving even the most systematic attempts to bury it. The Nag Hammadi text survived. Archaeological evidence survived. And now, through projects like The Chosen, we have the opportunity to restore these figures to their rightful place in history." The cameras captured Sarah's visible struggle as she processed the complete collapse of everything she had planned for this interview. What was supposed to be her moment of journalistic triumph had become a masterclass in how superficial research and predetermined conclusions could lead to embarrassing public failure. But more than that, she was grappling with the ethical implications of having nearly participated in perpetuating historical injustice. "I think what you've shown me tonight," Sarah said slowly, her professional composure finally returning but tempered with newfound humility, "is that the responsibility of anyone who speaks publicly about historical figures is far greater than I realized. The damage that can be done by repeating unverified claims, especially about people who can't defend themselves, is something I clearly underestimated." Jonathan nodded with the grace that had made him beloved by millions. "That's all any of us can do, Sarah. Learn, grow, and commit to seeking truth rather than confirming our preconceptions. Mary Magdalene deserves better than the story that's been told about her for centuries." she deserves to be remembered as the remarkable woman she actually was. As the interview concluded, both Jonathan and the viewing audience understood that something historic had occurred. Not just the defense of a misunderstood biblical figure, but a demonstration of how deep knowledge, moral conviction, and respectful dialogue could triumph over sensationalism and superficial research. Within hours, clips from the interview were spreading across social media, not as the controversial attack Sarah had planned, but as a powerful education in biblical scholarship and historical accuracy. Churches, universities, and book clubs began discussing the real Mary Magdalene, sparked by Jonathan's passionate defense of her true legacy. Sarah Mitchell's career took an unexpected turn as she publicly acknowledged her research failures and committed to deeper, more responsible journalism. The interview became a case study in media ethics, taught in journalism schools as an example of what happens when preparation meets predetermined conclusions rather than genuine inquiry. But perhaps most importantly, Mary Magdalene's true story began to emerge from centuries of deliberately constructed shadows, reclaiming her rightful place as one of Christianity's most important and influential figures, exactly as Jonathan Roumie had intended when he stepped forward to defend her honor on live television. The truth had not only prevailed, it had transformed everyone who encountered it, proving that sometimes the most powerful defense is simply telling the story that should have been told all along.